Good afternoon from Riga, Latvia, and welcome to the StratCom talks hosted by the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. My name is Elina Lange-Ionatamišvili, and I'm a senior expert at the NATO StratCom Center. Today we will be talking about audience analysis. And this is, of course, something that we know we must get right if we want our communications to be effective. But this is also something that we often don't get right because we lack time, we lack resources, and dare I say, sometimes we also lack in-depth understanding of all the wide variety of methodologies and approaches that are out there and what benefits they could bring. Today I will be joined by two experts, Gaby van den Berg, who is connecting from the Netherlands, and Dr. Thomas Colley, who is in the UK. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'll give a brief introduction to our experts. So Gaby has conducted audience analysis in many countries globally, and her company Emic Consulting teaches audience analysis and strategic communication to NATO defense organizations. Tom is a senior lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and also a visiting research fellow in war studies at King's College London. His research focuses on strategic communications, propaganda, and their utility in war and international politics. So thanks again for joining us today, Gaby and Tom. And before we start, Gaby, may I ask a question about the name of your company? Could you please tell us a little about the idea behind the word Emic?
Hi, Elina. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I would love to tell you about the word Emic because it's very close to my heart. It started when I was doing research and I was looking for a way to explain to people why we get so many things wrong in analysis of data, why we get so many things wrong in understanding audiences. It's because we label things from our perspective. We look at things from an outsider perspective, and we look at a group of people and we say, these are terrorists, or these are bad people. And of course, they wouldn't label themselves that way. Their internal logic is very different. Their culture is very different to us. And if we keep having conversations with people from our labeled perspectives and only look at the world through our lenses, we will miss this richness of understanding that comes from understanding a culture from within. And these terms come from anthropology. Ethic perspective really means an outside perspective, looking in on something from the outside, and an emic perspective means an understanding from within, understanding a culture from within. And I think in the military, there's a tendency to say, we look at binary terms. There's peace versus war. There's allies versus enemies. There's peace versus war. I said that. And I think, looking at cultures from an emic perspective can really help us make advances in audience analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gaby. I have a question before we start for Tom as well. Tom, in 2019, you published a book called Always at War, British Public Narratives of War. And war and conflict have, of course, always been highly contested topics in a society. And the point you're making in this book is that governments construct their strategic narratives based on what they think people are saying, what they think the story is, rather than on what the people actually say, because they don't know what people actually say. So you examined stories told by the society about Britain and about war. And what can this method give us? What does it reveal that the governments don't normally learn about their publics?
Thanks, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I mean, what really motivated the research was this sense that we live in a world where we always hear that narratives are the key to effective strategic communication, that in war is now a narrative battle, and whose story wins is more important than whose army wins. And I just found myself thinking, do we actually understand the stories people tell? Sure, we poll people, we survey them, and things like social listening are getting much more popular now. But do we actually sit people down and understand the stories they tell? What are the plots of their stories? What events do they include? What events do they silence? What have they forgotten? And how does this vary across cultures? So I sort of set out to find that out. And I suppose, without going into detail, great deal about the book, I would say the key thing is, if you're trying to persuade someone using stories, then understand the stories they tell in the first place. And in a sense, it's that simple. That's the idea.
But steering a little bit the conversation into the direction of understanding stories, you also speak about collective memory, for example, and what role does that play in understanding these stories. And I guess there are also other ways of how we can record and understand these stories. So it's not just what people convey to us verbally, but there are also other manifestations of this memory and people's worldview. So can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. I mean, how people remember conflicts. I mean, you often see this when it comes to nationalism, and manifestations of nationalism will highlight, great historical victories and tend to silence defeats, maybe silence atrocities, maybe highlight imperial conquests, maybe play them down, depending on the person's political perspective. And sure, that's inscribed and found in the monuments we have and the events we celebrate on a daily basis. I mean, if you think about, certainly in the US and the UK at the moment, there's a lot of talk of culture wars. And, those wars have physically manifested in the streets around statues of heroic figures that one side thinks should be protected and the other side thinks should be torn down. So certainly those are key parts of the national story. At the same time, what does that statue mean? How can you tell what that statue means unless you ask people what it means to them? And I guess that, again, coming back to the research, a statue doesn't sit on a street with a given meaning. The meaning comes from what we say about it and the images that we promote alongside it. And again, I think that's really important. I think it speaks to Gaby's Emic perspective too. To understand audiences effectively, you need to get under the skin of that, research it and understand it. And the more detail you do that, the better you understand your audience.
That sounds super exciting, Tom. Thank you. But it seems to me from experience that there is still a lot of reliance among governments and also international organizations on data that they get about their audiences from polls. Many policy decisions and engagement strategies are based on polling data, and at the same time we keep hearing a lot of criticism saying that polling data can be misleading, that it actually raises more questions than it gives answers. And what is your take on this? Gaby, let me start with you, please.
I think polling is a tool, and it's a tool that you use depending on the question you're trying to answer. And the more complex the question, the less we know about the area within which we're polling to begin with, the less useful polling is as a tool to answer questions for us. It gives us a lot of descriptive data. It tells us what. It gives us knowledge often. And then the reason it raises questions is because it gives us little understanding. And the other problem that I see with polling being used in this area is that there are so many places in which it can go wrong. It's a very complicated field of work. It's not a simple endeavor. It's not, oh, here's a list of questions and that will give us some insight. How you frame your questions, how much context you provide, all influences what answers you receive. If you ask people, should defense spending in your country go up, you will receive different answers from the same people, depending on whether you've asked them a question before that says, what are the biggest threats that you see to your country right now? Did you know that defense spending in your country has gone down for X amount of years in a row? And then you ask the question, do you think defense spending should go up? You will get different answers depending on the context you provide. Then there are questions around how reliable the data collection is, how reliable sampling is. And I think when we look at those quantitative or polling questions where we can actually see afterwards how correct they were, then we often see exactly how problematic they are. And the best example we have is exit polls. You know, you look at exit polls after an election, and then they had it completely wrong. And you would imagine that if you then take a much more complex area within which you're trying to ask questions, that, you know, polling can only take you so far. And the danger is that it results in numbers that then stick, because people love statistics, they love a good number. And then all of a sudden that becomes common knowledge, it becomes accepted knowledge that is based on very flawed research. Now, that's not always the case. I'm not saying it's you know, polling is not useful. I'm saying it's over relied on, I think.
Thank you, Gaby. Tom, following up on this, in your opinion, what could be, you know, viable alternatives to these traditional ways that governments and international organizations use for audience research, provided that there is always the lack of time and resources? But, you know, what could be some alternatives, how we could understand our audiences better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the key for me is that no source of data is perfect. All we have are different sources of data that offer different windows on the social world. Okay, so polls offer maybe attitudinal data tinged with a bit of social desirability bias, and depending on the sample, depending on you know, who you're and the means, whether you're in person, whether you're online, whether you're on the telephone, and what the issue is, and the context, the relative usefulness and representativeness of that data will vary. But you'd be foolish to think that any other data source is any better. The polling industry at least has a century of practice, of refinement in methods. If you look at things like big data, which I know we're going to discuss, I'm sure we will, there's 20 years perhaps of experience, and it's far more limited. The thing is, both of those are really useful data sources, particularly if you can combine them and triangulate with different sources. And I know governments like focus groups too, but of course it depends how creative you get with your focus groups. I was involved in some focus groups on disinformation, where we actually got people in the room and gave them pieces of true and false information and got them to discuss how they navigate these things and how they interacted with them. So firstly, no one data is perfect, no one method is perfect. Try and combine them if you can, but also there's scope to get creative there with how you use each one. But don't assume any is the magic bullet for understanding audiences. The more you can access, the better.
Thanks, Tom. Let me quickly ask you, Gaby, as you were listening to Tom, is there anything from your memory that comes to you as a really original or experimental piece of work in audience research, something really interesting or fun that you could share?
Well, I think one of the things that is underutilized is data that is out there that you can just observe. And, you know, we rely on asking people so many questions, and then, you know, we grapple with these problems. And some things you can just go out and observe. And I remember being in Africa doing a study on waste management, and people couldn't believe that a lot of rubbish was dumped around containers. It was never in the container, it was always around the container. And you went to ask people and you went to talk to them, and they would all complain about it. And they would say, well, it needs to be in the container. And it was very rare that you saw people putting rubbish out, you know. And then I thought, well, we just have to put people near these containers and observe what is happening, because that's the only way we're going to find a solution to this super simple problem. Like, why is the rubbish next to the container? And two things would happen. The first is that culturally, putting the rubbish out is passed down the line in families. So it's always the youngest person who can walk and drag, you know, a bin bag that would take the rubbish out, and they couldn't reach the container. So you saw them struggling and, you know, putting it there, and it would fall on the ground. They couldn't do anything about it. And the other thing was, people would approach this mess, and they would stand there with a bin bag, and they would say, well, where am I going to put it? So they would just chuck it, they would just hurl it in the direction of the container. And I think, and that's a simplistic example, but I think we're missing the use of observational data, of gamification, of, other types of data collection that aren't, asking people quantitative questions or sitting down and having conversations. And I think we can have a lot of fun with that. As Tom was saying, you can be quite creative in coming up with ways of gathering data and getting people to do experiments, getting them to do things, debate things, among each other, also really gives a lot of insight.
Great, thank you, Gaby. At this point, since you mentioned experimentation, I would like to show our viewers a short video, an intervention by Dr. Mārtiņš Kaprants, who is also a researcher and has done a lot of research on audiences in Latvia in particular, and unfortunately he could not join us today because he has another event, but I will ask my colleagues to put up the video for you so we can hear from Mārtiņš.
Policy decisions are often based on polling data, on survey data, but it very much depends, of course, who conducts the survey. But sometimes, of course, they overlook some details, and I think the most important problem is that, as far as I have experienced it actually, is that our strategic communicators in government are somehow afraid of quantitative experimental data. Say we can have survey data, but we can have also experimental survey data. Testing how, for example, how society or different actors of information ecosystem behave when you manipulate with some conditions. When you have different samples, you use the same questions. For example, there are different techniques. You can use the same questions but in different order asked in survey. So it's the most simplest way how to experiment and see how it influences answers of respondents. And all these samples are actually rather representative. They might be around 700-800 respondents, but different respondents in each sample. And then you can experiment with the same questions but changing frames in these questions. Say, you can ask whether you are afraid of Russian influence or Chinese influence, and you can see how society reacts. Maybe it's not so common that it is treated with a proper attitude among policymakers.
So that was Dr. Mārtiņš Kaprants with some ideas on how we could actually turn the usual polling or surveying into something more interesting and experimental to get different comparative perspectives. Now, moving on with our conversation. So you, Tom, mentioned big data. And indeed, I think we should be talking about that, how these, the increased digitalization and availability of different technologies offers us new perspectives, how audiences could be analyzed. And one of the things that is being done with big data is it's being used to detect sentiments and predict behaviors. And I'm not so convinced how effective is that. Let me turn to Gaby and ask, Gaby, what do you see as advantages and also as limitations of using big data to make predictions about audiences?
So, again, it depends on the question that you're asking. And I think, as Tom was saying earlier, no method for any research is perfect. You use as many different methods as you can, and you triangulate data. The definition of big data is literally that it's big. There is a lot of it, and it doesn't, it tends to not fit on your laptop. That doesn't mean it's good data. It doesn't mean it's useful for the question you have. I think where most advances in big data currently have come from, especially in predicting behavior, is surrounding epidemiology, for example, but also surrounding complex logistical problems, surrounding questions that have to do with complex problems such as fleet optimization for UPS and Woolworths and credit tech organizations that have come up with 20,000 data points that you can use to determine an individual's credit worthiness and how likely they are to pay back their credit. I think in those arenas, it's very easy to use big data to predict behavior to a certain extent. Similarly, we have sort of micro successes when it comes to predicting how well a movie is going to do, how much it's going to gross at the box office from early reviews and from how many people are engaging in online conversations. So that's where I think a lot can be done with big data. When it comes to, what we call the wicked societal problems that governments are grappling with, there's a lot less that big data can add at this point in time. And I think that we often ask the wrong big data question. We're asking, how can big data help us understand our audience, rather than asking the question, which method is best suited to answer this particular question that we have about a particular audience, and then big data might form a part of the answer.
Tom,
can I add something there?
Yeah, sure. I was giving you the floor, and I also wanted to mention that you worked with representativeness of social media data in audience analysis. So please, by all means, go ahead and give us your view on big data and also on the social media data in audience research.
Thanks, Elina. Well, I mean, as a category, as a sort of subcategory of big data, obviously there is a great appeal to social media data that somehow this might, unlike a poll, produce somehow naturally occurring data on populations' beliefs, attitudes, maybe even their behaviours. I think the thing is, having looked at the research on this, there's a distinctly mixed view. You'll have some papers which say, we predicted this election result based on volume of Twitter traffic on this issue or these hashtags or so on. But at the same time, what often happens with those is that they've actually, or it's not clear whether researchers have simply got their body of data and in retrospect mined it to find something that could have predicted it if they'd known what to look for in the first place. So a lot of studies that say we can predict the future of X, this given political social phenomena with big data, are actually saying we could have predicted the past event if we'd known before it which variables of the hundreds and thousands we could look for in this data if we'd known that at the time. And so that's a little bit of an issue. The second one, and I think is really important, when it comes to, if you're going to predict with big data, you're basically trying to generalize in some way. You're trying to say that this set of traces implies something is going to happen in future. The key thing to understand better, though, is what type of data do you have? If we take the most common platform used in social media research, Twitter, or people might use hashtags to learn something from them. But someone commenting on Twitter is a subset of a national population, a global population, who is willing to comment publicly, so that's an even smaller subset, that you're assuming the meaning they attach to the phrases they use or the hashtags they use are the same ones that you think they are as a researcher. Okay. Not only that, those users are interspersed by a bunch of people who dominate the conversation, many of which are states, non-state actors, commercial actors, bots trying to influence the conversation. So this is not naturally occurring data in any meaningful way. It's created on a platform designed to shape communication in a certain way. It's an active space in which actors are vying for influence and to shape people's views. And the people commenting are mostly human, but only a particular subcategory as human willing to comment. Okay, so if you add all that together, you can see why there are certain studies that have said it's a real problem to get the answers we want from social media data, even though we want it to provide the answers because we've got so much of it and it's relatively cheap and readily available. So I very much endorse Gaby's point on that.
Yeah, so from what you're saying, Tom, seems that the suggestions that sometimes are made to build the whole audience analysis strategy on social listening, on social media listening, is actually not such a good idea, because that does not reflect necessarily the real life conversations.
Well, do you mind if I just interrupt? I'm really sorry.
Yeah, sure.
It's not so much that it's not a good idea. I quite like to frame it more optimistically and say, you will be better at it the better you understand these things. So the way people use hashtags in South Korea is different from how they use them in Germany and how they use that in America. If you understand that, then your target audience analysis will be better than if you don't. This speaks to Gaby's Emic perspective again. So I think what you need to add, you need that subject matter expertise. You need understanding of the culture you're in. I'll give you an example. When interviewing for this project, I spoke to someone working in the Middle East, and they were talking about trying to understand the attitudes of women and trying to infer that from, I honestly forget which platform. I think it was WhatsApp they were looking to use. And then they said that they discovered on the ground that women were often gave themselves male avatars and male profiles because they didn't want to be harassed by men online. So in other words, if you didn't understand that, you would literally be taking as male data on female, or vice versa. So in other words, unless you have that cultural understanding of context, you might have a massive block of big data, but it doesn't mean it's measuring what you think it does. And so that understanding is key. The better you understand it, the better you can do it. You've got to use some methods. Just try and understand the context in which people are using them better, is what I would say would make target audience analysis better.
Yeah, and preferably cross-referencing that with other qualitative or quantitative methods, right? Gaby, you wanted to add something.
Just one very quick point to that, because in addition to these problems that Tom is highlighting, this fact that these conversations online get polarized quite quickly, they become echo chambers of extreme views. In addition to that, there is not enough research available about that link between online and offline behavior. So those people who do want to comment online and state their beliefs, their attitudes, their intent even, or their intentions, how much of that actually translates into real world behavior? That's another question that we just don't have enough answers to at this point.
Right. This brings me to the topic of COVID pandemic, and I think that with the lockdown and all the restrictions, everybody is spending more time online. I mean, we are currently spending our time online. I'm actually in a studio. This was like a very pleasant experience for me to get out of my house and drive around the town and arrive here and see some real people. But this pandemic has definitely influenced social behaviors, and it has also influenced information consumption patterns, and it has also influenced the way we research audiences. So my question to you on the pandemic is twofold. So firstly, do you think the social change that has taken place, will that be something permanent? At least to some extent. And secondly, what does it mean to those who research audiences? How their profession will change for better or worse? Gaby, let's start with you.
Ooh, it's an excellent question. And the answer to the first question you posed, to what extent is it permanent? How will it change people? I don't think we can say that with any certainty yet. I don't think we can grasp fully what will happen. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. This period of uncertainty is unprecedented. There are so many economic and social uncertainties about what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And people's expectation about the future will probably change over the next short-term periods. And that has implications for research. Also, I think that there are positives about the pandemic for research, specifically for researching audiences. I think we have a very tangible outcome in the research space, which is obvious, is the rapid adoption of online research. And we fast forwarded digitization of research methods. The other thing that I think is fascinating is that because conversations are all of a sudden so similar in so many countries around the world, it's very interesting to study how different cultures react to this shared global experience. And I think there are a lot of opportunities there for research and for changing forms of audience research. But in terms of how it will change in the long term, and what the behaviors are that will stick, what the things are that will change again when going out will become safe again, I think is very difficult to predict, especially also because people's experience of the pandemic influences how they think about it. And we did a few small-scale interviews with people about their experiences of the pandemic just last year. And of course, some people have a positive experience. They are finally home with their family. They live in a house with a garden where they have enough outside space. They can do their work from home, so they don't have a loss of income. And for them, it's the realization that, they would love to spend more time with their family, that, they enjoy working from home. There are a lot of people who have suffered a lot. There are people with small children who couldn't go to school, who have lost their job. There are people who have lost close family members, and that has colored their entire experience and their fear of this virus. There are also people who have had COVID and have had no symptoms, or don't know anyone who has experienced any severe symptoms of COVID. And those people might be more inclined to say, well, we should go back to normal as quickly as possible. We need to end this lockdown. So I really think that we shouldn't underestimate how much personal experiences of different people of COVID-19, of the pandemic, influences how they think about it as a societal problem.
And what about your job as a researcher, Tom? How does that influence the pandemic, your work?
Well, I'd say several things in response to this question. Again, trying to be as optimistic as possible in, of course, tragic circumstances. For me, it highlights the importance of segmentation, and again, that contextual point. If we think about vaccine uptake, whilst we might try, and of course it's a really important thing to try and do, to distribute vaccines globally and do that as best as we can. But, why vaccine hesitancy is so much higher in France or in certain ethnic groups and not others is something that's been known about for a while, but also we don't really understand fully why uptake in some groups is so high and in other groups is so low. And so actually, really, it's a really big wake-up call to say and take that opportunity. We need to understand audiences at a greater level of granularity, and COVID is kind of giving us the data to show where the issues are. There are so many questions we don't know the answers to, which is on the one hand frustrating, but on the other hand sort of exciting. It can lead you to where future research needs to go. The other one, and this is perhaps reflects my research on disinformation. Unfortunately, what COVID has shown is definitive evidence of the impact of disinformation, misinformation on behavior. You've seen people injuring themselves and dying through attempting false remedies for the disease, and that has caused deaths worldwide. So there was a lot of debate over years about how much impact disinformation has, how important it is, can it shape elections, can't it shape elections. What we've seen, unfortunately, is a direct link between beliefs or communication about them and behavior. And so that's actually quite useful in the sense that it's advanced that conversation several years and perhaps woken us up to, if we don't deal with this, if we don't get better at countering it, that can have real life consequences. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that lots has been learned. The other thing that's been learned, again, which is a real positive, is people have used Google search quite effectively, which if you think about it, isn't necessarily social. It's just you're inputting something into a research engine. And symptom trackers, both of those have been quite useful. And what you've seen in certain countries is that the official list of symptoms of COVID for example, which are used to make people self-isolate or take time off work or whatever it is, has been updated because of the analysis of very large data sets of people saying, actually, I thought this was just about a cough and I've got a stomach problem, or I have headaches or something. And so actually we've seen the potential to analyze these things in real time, both with traditional methods at large scale and through big data. And we've managed to learn a striking amount, a really impressive amount over the course of the last year, even as we're humbled by the fact that we still don't know anywhere near enough. So there's plenty of positives amongst all the negatives.
I like your positive outlook, Tom. Gaby, can I ask you a very practical question? So, as all research companies, sociological research companies, are trying to survive and maintain their heads above the water, they try to offer transition of the traditional research methods, interviews and focus groups, to online environments. So a lot is done on Zoom. So they say, okay, fine, we'll decrease the number of focus group participants, for example, from the maximum of 8 to, let's say, maximum of 6, etc., etc. So they offer these online solutions, and because the consumers, the clients have no choice, they agree to that and they say, okay, let's go for it. But don't you think that this actually changes the process, and it has very specific drawbacks to it that we should be keeping in mind when we agree to this transfer of traditional, face-to-face research methods to an online setting?
For sure. I think that as long as we're aware of how it changes social dynamic to an extent, we can account for those biases, we can account for the differences. I think there are also a lot of things that we are learning do work online almost as well, or just as well as in a face-to-face setting. One of the prior problems with online research was that not everyone had access to the internet. It wasn't very easy for some people to be online, and especially older generations you wouldn't be able to reach them through online interviews. Now that's changing. As grandmothers can't connect with their children or grandchildren in real life, someone goes over to their house, sets up their computer with Zoom, and you have this whole older generation on Zoom talking to their grandchildren now. So I think adoption of video calls has gone up, which has made it easier to then also recruit people for online research. People are more familiar with Zoom. We're less, we're less frightened by it to an extent. I mean, if you never use Zoom ever in your life, and then all of a sudden you participate in research online, then that's a big step. If all your meetings in your whole life are online because your company now does everything online, then logging off and logging in for an online interview for a research project is not such a big step anymore. So I think there are a lot of positive ways in which we can use online research. It's easy to record, it's easy to mute people, those dominant respondents, you can mute them and say, I'm going to give the floor to someone else. So that is easier because online, actually, it's less rude to mute someone mid-conversation and saying, in the interest of time, I have to do this. Whereas in a real focus group, and you have these dominant respondents that you're trying to deal with, that can be much harder. So there are positives. It's somehow also, there's a little bit of a barrier. So talking about certain things that are emotionally more difficult for people to talk about, somehow that barrier gets reduced a little bit in some settings. And then there are obvious drawbacks that we knew about, which is why we used to favor in-person research. You can make eye contact, you can read emotions much more easily, you can pick up on more subtle body language. So there is this area of or richness that you're missing, especially in the emotional landscape. But I think as long as we're aware, then we can work with that. And we can then say, okay, well, these are things that we have to account for in our analysis. But I think overall it's been a very positive change as well in experimenting with online research more.
So now I would like to turn to some questions from our audience. We have about 20 minutes left in this discussion. One question was about governments, so to say, throwing away certain audiences. So the way I understand the question is, what is your view on the approach where, we decide that these people are not worth communicating with because they will never buy our communication about a certain policy, let's say. So what do you think? Do you think it's actually, kind of a pragmatic thing to do? Because we rarely have resources to work with everyone and convince everyone. So would you agree to this approach that there are audiences not worth trying to convince? Tom, what do you think about that?
Without wishing to flip the question, I think the way I would like to think about it is actually, if you start out thinking, what's my communication objective? And then you think, what audiences am I trying to influence? Then it's not a question of saying, I've got a whole country, I'm going to throw away this audience or discard that audience and only focus on those. Rather, hopefully your communication process will start being targeted and you start with that understanding of which audiences matter. So in that sense, I think that mindset is something a little bit different rather than saying these people are not worth communicating with. The second point I'd raise though is, it is a real dilemma. Early research in strategic narratives about the war in Afghanistan would say, look, we've got a 30-something country coalition here. We need this grand golden strategic narrative so that everyone gets behind the mission and everyone understands why they're there. And then, of course, attempts to achieve this fail because you can't come up with a story sufficient to persuade all target audiences in 30-something countries without it being so vague. It would have to be so vague as to be almost meaningless and just have these generalities about freedom and so on and so forth. So actually, it is a real dilemma. Personally, if I'm being completely honest, I can't think of a simple solution. So you do have to make decisions. In general, and again, it's about having that understanding. If you're communicating to more audiences, then you're going to have to go more general with your messaging. And if you're going to communicate in a more targeted way, you might have some more scope to narrow things down. We've seen around elections some quite impressive micro-targeting of audiences online. And so there are things that can be done to target messaging too. But the key thing is, does the researcher, whether that's someone in government, a practitioner or an academic, have an understanding of who they're trying to communicate with so that they can broaden or narrow their message accordingly?
Thanks, Tom. Gaby, do you want to add something on that?
Well, I agree fundamentally with Tom on all points. And I think that the exceptions would be when you're talking about problems, let's take COVID-19, the pandemic again, when it comes to health behaviors. If a government needs to communicate to its citizens about health behaviors, you cannot say this group is too small to communicate with. You need to be inclusive. You need to ensure it is your job as a government to reach everyone. It's your job to be understood, to provide information in a way that people can access, of course. Similarly, if your communication is about getting people to participate in democracy, getting people to vote, you cannot say, well, these people, they don't believe in democracy or they don't want to vote, so it's not worth even, trying to communicate with them. But overall, as Tom explained, the dilemma, I agree with all those points.
Gaby, whom you would perceive as particularly antagonistic. Is it worth working with those?
It depends, I think. I think there's no answer in saying yes or no, because sometimes the resources that you need to do that, are great, and then it depends on what the topic is. what people are antagonistic against, what we're trying to convince them of, it's very specific, I think, that you need to start looking at problems in real examples and then debate those rather than say, in general, I think, this isn't worth it or is worth it.
Yeah, exactly, because sometimes it can actually be a very easy way out. For example, finding a common cause or common enemy. So they may still be antagonistic towards certain policies or certain ways you represent yourself, but they may actually align with you on something else. So I completely agree. This has to be discussed in a frame of a real life example. Another question that we had was about ethics. So as both of you probably know, it's a big question for NATO countries and defense structures who have great capabilities actually to do audience research and conduct communications campaigns or information operations. But there are certain restrictions, what we can or can't do at home and in peacetime. So what do you think, in your opinion, so not just military, but also the political establishment, where are some red lines when, too much is too much? What is acceptable in terms of going deeper into researching our domestic audiences and understanding them? I mean, different countries have different regulations. For example, let's say Scandinavian countries, a lot of the time are super sensitive about it, and they say, well, the less we know, the better, actually. And there is, a certain historical consciousness that drives them to these attitudes. So what is your take on that? Tom, maybe you can start off.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about this as an academic, obviously any research I've done, you have to go through an ethical approval process where you document in detail. The main concern is, are you harming your audience in some way? Now, this then gets very different. When I went around the country interviewing citizens for how they understood war, they sign a consent form, you explain in detail, this is what we're doing. If you're not willing, you can back out at any point. When it comes to online, things get a bit grayer because you have this dynamic where people have probably clicked on some terms and conditions, which they may or may not have read. I mean, that's what the research shows us. I mean, how many of us go in detail down the terms of conditions of every website we come to? And people may have signed up to have their data used for these things without realizing. And it's a really thorny issue then. Who's responsible if you've signed up for something? But of course, the key points are, I mean, from an academic perspective, you adhere to your ethical research frameworks. From a national government perspective, I guess you adhere to your national or international guidelines, your data protection regulations. And, if you do that, then it's likely that the audience analysis you do will be ethically robust. But I think the other thing that's really important for me in my research is that researchers are really reflexive, that they think very hard about the influence they're having on their research and the people that they're researching. And that's very applicable whether you're interviewing someone on Zoom, or you're in someone's home. And as long as you're reflexive about that and very open about that in your research and in your writing, then that's another way that research from an academic perspective can be made somewhat more ethical.
Thank you, Tom. Gaby, would you like to comment on this question?
Yes, I think there are two dimensions to the ethics question, and one of them is the one that Tom talked about just now, which would be the ethics of research, the ethics of conducting research in this field of work, in behavioral science or social science to begin with, and then there's a lot of practical ethical questions around, how easy is it to obtain, written consent from illiterate populations? How, there are a lot of practical problems that we need good ethical frameworks for. And there's a second element to this question, which is the ethics of influence in and of itself. When is it ethical or unethical for governments to use behavioral science or to conduct influence, to conduct strategic communications to begin with? And I think in that area, there is less information. I mean, the ethics of research are relatively well established. We've got data protection laws, we've got frameworks we adhere to, we've got consent forms, we've got, you know, ways of managing data, anonymizing data, explaining the research to participants. That's all quite well established. Much less is established in ethical frameworks of using influence to begin with. And I think, I mean, I read Sunstein's book, The Ethics of Influence, recently, and he talks about welfare, dignity, autonomy, and preserving choice architecture, in saying that in some instances it's unethical not to influence. And I would agree with that. I think that when it comes to people, you know, as the example Tom gave, harming themselves because they are injecting some sort of cleaning materials because they think it stops them from contracting COVID, it would be unethical not to try to use influence to stop people from doing that. But again, you know, we do need strong frameworks for that. We do need to say, does this enhance the welfare of people? Does it preserve choice architecture? And in a military context, I think influence where we can preserve a choice architecture for people and give them a choice, do I do this or do I not do this, is always preferable over coercion. You know, and I think, you know, a government can say, well, you know, you have a choice. If you don't fill out your tax return on time, you get a penalty. And that is influencing people to fill out their tax return on time, but they can still choose not to do it. So I think if we keep those ethical principles around welfare, autonomy, dignity, then there's a great space for the use of influence in a very ethical way.
Thanks, Gaby. I wanted to also ask, and this is not directly about audience research per se, but, you know, I don't think we can look at audience research as some kind of a, you know, separate thing, a separate planet. We do audience research because we want to build, you know, influence strategies or communication plans, and then, you know, we implement them, and then we want to understand whether this had any kind of effect on our audience, and that is also some form of an audience research. So I wanted to ask both of you about the measurement of effects. You know, what do you think is the best practice, provided that a lot of governments and organizations do not actually have a lot of resources? And I think a lot of the time what happens is we hopefully do the initial audience research, build the comms campaign, do it, and then, you know, we have the outputs of, you know, what was it that we did, but we don't necessarily know what real effect did it have. So with limited resources, what would you say are the best strategies to actually look at you know, the effects? Tom, what would you say?
It's a really, really challenging issue. Well, I would say that firstly, anticipating things in advance. If you've baked the measurement of effect into your sort of planning cycle of the whole thing, then you're more likely to be able to identify the right sort of metrics and analyze them. Obviously, the most obvious things people will try and identify is how much interaction something gets, how many retweets, how many likes, how many site visits. Maybe in marketing, you know, if people have got, you know, you can track how many purchases derive from something. But of course, we know that that doesn't necessarily tell you how people are interacting, how they felt in the process. So it's very hard to give any answer other than try and use as many different sources as possible to triangulate. We can get measures of reach in a fairly straightforward now, the popularity or how much engagement something has. And if that's all you've got time for and resources you have, I guess that's what you do. But being completely honest, the answer again is trying to draw on as many sources as you can to gain insights. And if they can be quantitative, qualitative, and if you've already worked out what audiences you're interested in, if you've managed to get subject matter expertise involved in the process of designing your strategic communications, then again, you're more likely to have a better understanding of where to look. So basically, I would talk about front-loading the process so you understand it better, and then just honestly understand the limitations of whatever metrics you're lucky enough to get access to, and not overclaim on the basis of them.
Gaby, over to you.
So a firm yes to front loading. When we teach audience analysis, we always start with evaluation, because we start with making something measurable and behavioral. If we want people to show support, or if we want justice, or if we want less corruption, or if we want, more freedom, we've got to determine what it looks like. And I think that step is crucial for both evaluation and for your audience analysis, because if you don't know, and I call it the crystal ball question, if you don't know what the world should look like if you have been successful in achieving what you want to achieve, then there is no way that you can get there. So I think answering those questions upfront, what does the world look like if I am successful? That will give you your measurement framework, your measurement of effectiveness framework. Second, when you do your audience analysis, you can then also take a baseline of the behavior that you're seeking. Is it already occurring? How much is it occurring? Your baseline data can be collected at exactly the same time as you do audience analysis. And then what you have to do is add one more round of research, even if you have few resources, but calculate it into your project to say what has changed in the real world as a result of our actions, because otherwise we're always going to be stuck either in an attitudinal space where we say, well, people feel better about it, or we reached this many people, we stuck with these measurements of performance rather than measurements of effectiveness, or worse than that, we don't learn how our audience analysis can improve the decisions we make, because we never measure how it plays out once we've designed our campaigns. So I think, let's get rid of this fear of failure that we have, and let's say, how do we learn? How do we learn during implementation? How do we learn, even during audience analysis, by taking baselines? And I really think it's crucial. I can't, people who've been on courses with me, they know how much I hammer on about this. We cannot learn unless we measure what we're doing and we measure the effectiveness. So it's definitely worth calculating it into your budget from the get-go.
In your opinion, Gaby, let me just expand a bit more. What do you think, is it worth actually for government organizations or international organizations such as NATO to build in-house capability for audience analysis and conduct of comms campaigns and then measurement of effects? Or would you rather argue that it should be outsourced? Because as you of course know, some issues that are being dealt with are rather sensitive, and there's the question of disclosure. Also, there's the tendency, especially for civil servants or anyone who works in a hierarchical organization, to be afraid to say, well, actually we failed. People tend to want to pat themselves on the shoulder and say, yeah, we did a really great job with this campaign, look at these fantastic results. But whether that is true or not, we don't know. So what would be your take on this? Building in-house or outsourcing, maybe parts in-house and part outsourced? What would you advise?
You can always outsource elements, but I'm 100% in favor of capability building in this space. One, because without a solid understanding of those issues we've discussed, issues surrounding which audiences do you want to reach, what is the problem that you're trying to tackle, how do you make it behavioral, those questions are questions that have to be answered internally before you even go out and do research. An understanding of what that research looks like, connecting with your audience through audience analysis, in being involved in the conversations, being involved in the research, already closes that gap interpreting that data and turning it into workable strategy. So I really think there's a lot to say for bringing it in-house, and data collection elements of that can still be outsourced. For certain types of programs, you might want to outsource data collection on evaluation, depending on whether it's sensitive or not, depending on how large scale it is. You can still work with partners, but I do think there's a need for a better understanding of both research and evaluation in-house, so that even if you do outsource, it can be done in a better way.
Great. Tom, 20 seconds, agree or disagree?
I agree. You need people, particularly in a political context, to understand the complex politics of a situation, and you need to bring that to any off-the-shelf data analysis package you have or any outsourcing. So you need that. And so I think in-house capability is vital. I agree.
Great. With that, we have run out of time. I think we had a very interesting discussion on a super important subject for strategic communications. I would like to thank both our speakers, Gaby van den Berg and Dr. Thomas Colley, for their contributions. And before we say goodbye to you, I just want to remind you that next StratCom talk is expected on the 31st of March, and we will be talking about Russia's activities and Africa's information space. So please join us again on the 31st of March. Thank you very much and goodbye.